A man who had already buried his heart was approached by a ghost. She was a little girl, no older than 10, with eyes that had seen the end of the world, and she whispered a sentence that was both a prayer and a lit fuse. Your son isn't dead. For the biker known only as Preacher, a man entombed in grief, these words were an earthquake. What followed was not a riot, but a reckoning. It was the story of how a legion of men clad in leather and steel, men the world saw as monsters, rode out to challenge a conspiracy of greed and silence, all to reclaim one lost boy. They moved like a storm, not to break the law, but to uphold a higher one, the sacred code of family, and in doing so, they unearthed a truth that would not only rewrite one man's past, but would forge a new future for them all, proving that the greatest heroes are often the ones you'd be taught to fear. The alley was a cathedral of misery, and Lily was its most devout worshiper. It smelled of sour milk and wet cardboard, a perfume she knew better than her own name. The wind, a razor-sharp entity born in the frozen canyons between skyscrapers, howled arias of pure malice. It found every tear in her thin jacket, every gap in the worn-out blanket she'd pulled from a dumpster. It wasn't just cold, it was an active, searching thing, a predator hunting for the last dregs of warmth in her small, shivering body. She was 10 years old, though her eyes held the weary mileage of a soul that had lived 100 lifetimes of disappointment. Her world had shrunk to this foul crevice, this sliver of space between a brick wall bleeding graffiti and a row of overflowing metal trash cans. This was her home, her fortress, her cage. Her fingers, numb and blue, were curled tightly around a small, smooth object in her pocket. It was a bird, a little wooden bird, carved from a single piece of pine, its wings half spread as if caught between perching and taking flight. It was her only treasure, her only proof, her mission. Across the street, light and noise spilled from the doorway of a squat cinder-block building. The sign above it was a snarling skull with wrenches for crossbones. Reapers of Redemption MC, it read in jagged, blood-red letters. To anyone else, it was a den of danger, a place to be avoided, a nest of society's outcasts. To Lily, it was the end of a very long, very terrifying journey. It was her last and only hope. She watched the men who came and went. They were giants, all of them. Mountains of muscle and denim and worn leather, their arms covered in tattoos that spilled down their forearms like inked rivers. Their faces were hard, carved from granite and cynicism, framed by wild beards and long hair. They laughed with voices like gravel churning in a cement mixer, their boots scuffing the pavement with an authority that made the very ground seem to tremble. They were terrifying. They were everything she had been taught to run from. But she couldn't run. Not anymore. Because inside her, a promise was burning. A promise she'd made to a boy with haunted eyes in a place that was supposed to be a hospital, but felt more like a prison, a boy named Caleb. And one of these giants, the biggest one of all, was Caleb's father. She had to tell him. She had to make him believe. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, so cold it was almost hot. What if he didn't listen? What if he laughed at her? What if he hurt her? She was a ghost, a whisper of a girl. He was a mountain. Mountains don't listen to whispers. They endure them. But the wooden bird in her pocket felt heavy. It was a weight of responsibility, a promise made in the dark. So she waited. She watched. She gathered the shredded remnants of her courage, piece by tiny piece, as the city lights painted long, distorted shadows that danced around her like mocking specters. Preacher felt the cold, but it was an old friend. It was a different kind of cold than the wind whipping down the street. His was an internal winter, a permafrost that had settled deep in his bones 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days ago. It was the day he had been told his son, his only child, Caleb, was gone. The word they had used was deceased, a clinical, sterile, soul-destroying word. It didn't capture the supernova of pain, the collapsing of his entire universe into a single point of unbearable blackness. It didn't describe the silence that followed, a silence that had screamed in his ears ever since. He stood on the sidewalk outside the clubhouse, the familiar rumble of his brother's laughter and the wail of a blues guitar behind him, a distant, muffled soundtrack to his private hell. He was their president, their leader, the patriarch Bear. They called him preacher not because he was religious, but because when he spoke, his word was gospel. He was the unshakable center of their chaotic world, the moral compass for men who had lost their way. Snorts. What a joke! He was a compass whose needle was broken, spinning uselessly, forever pointing to a grave in a manicured cemetery miles away. He pulled a thick, hand-rolled cigarette from the pocket of his leather vest, the Reaper logo on the back, a heavy, familiar weight. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of engines and fights, were steady as he lit it, a small, defiant flame against the encroaching dark. He remembered the accident in flashes, a slideshow of horrors his mind refused to let him forget. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, the metallic shriek of a world tearing itself apart, the sight of his son's small bicycle, twisted into a pretzel of mangled chrome under the grill of a delivery truck. He'd gotten the call at the clubhouse. He'd broken every traffic law getting to the hospital, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But he was too late. A doctor with tired eyes and a practiced, sympathetic frown had met him in a hallway that smelled of bleach and despair. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Calloway. There was extensive trauma. We did everything we could." They hadn't let him see the body. "It's better this way," a kind nurse had said, her hand on his arm. "Remember him as he was." So he had. A closed casket funeral, a small, polished headstone. Caleb Michael Calloway, beloved son. 5 years. He had visited that stone every single Sunday, rain or shine. He would stand there, a mountain of a man talking to a patch of grass, telling his boy about his week, about the club, about the hollow space in his chest that never ever filled. The grief wasn't a wave anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was the ocean itself. He was submerged in it, breathing it, living in its crushing, silent depths. He functioned. He led. He protected his men. But he did not live. He existed, a ghost haunting the architecture of his own life. The cigarette burned down to his knuckles, and he barely felt it. He dropped the butt, crushing it under the heel of his heavy boot. He was about to turn, to go back inside and drown the silence with bourbon and the company of his brothers, when he felt it. A presence, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, in the deep shadows of the alley across the street. He went still, every instinct honed by years of watching his own back screaming to attention. He wasn't a man who was easily startled. He was the one who did the startling. He squinted, his eyes cutting through the gloom. It was nothing. A piece of trash blown by the wind. A stray cat. And then the shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. It was small, impossibly small. A child, a little girl, wrapped in rags, stepping out from behind a dumpster with the hesitation of a fawn emerging onto a highway. Her face was a pale, smudged oval in the dim light, dominated by eyes that were too big, too old, too full of a terror that was aimed directly at him. His first thought was that she was lost. His second was a surge of protective anger. What was a kid doing out here, this late, in this part of town? He stayed perfectly still, not wanting to scare her. He softened his posture, a difficult task for a man built like a grizzly bear. He kept his hands visible, away from his sides. "You okay, kid?" he called out, his voice a low rumble, softer than he intended. She flinched at the sound, a full-body tremor, but she didn't run. She took another shaky step forward, then another, crossing the street like she was traversing a minefield. The headlights of a passing car washed over her for a second, illuminating her pinched face, the grime on her cheeks, the desperate, raw resolve in her expression. She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that he could see her shivering, not just from the cold, but from sheer, unadulterated fear. She was looking up at him, her neck craned, as if staring at a skyscraper. He felt ridiculously, unnervingly large. He crouched down slowly, bending his stiff knees until he was closer to her level. The worn leather of his pants creaked in the sudden silence. The sounds of the clubhouse seemed a million miles away. "Hey," he said again, his voice barely a whisper now. "You lost? You need help?" She just stared, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He could see she was trying to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She was a bird with a broken wing, a stray who had forgotten the sound of a kind voice. He was about to ask if she was hungry, if she needed a place to stay warm, when she finally found her voice. It was a tiny, fragile thing, a thread of sound nearly stolen by the wind. "Sir? Yeah, kid, I'm here." She swallowed hard, a visible, painful effort. She took one last deep breath, as if plunging into icy water, and then she said the words, the impossible words that cracked the foundations of his world. "Sir, your son, Caleb, he isn't dead." For a full 10 seconds, the world ceased to exist. There was no cold wind, no distant music, no grimy street. There was only the girl's pale face and the echo of her whisper, a sound that was louder than a bomb blast in the tomb of his heart. His first reaction was a flash of white-hot rage, a blinding, murderous fury. What kind of sick, twisted joke was this? Who would send a child to deliver such a cruel, depraved lie? His hand clenched into a fist so tight the bones groaned, the leather of his gloves straining at the seams. He felt a growl build deep in his chest, a sound of pure animalistic wrath. He was going to find out who was behind this, and he was going to tear them apart. He looked at the girl, ready to unleash a torrent of fury, to demand who sent her, to terrify the truth out of her. But then he saw her face. It wasn't the face of a prankster. It wasn't cruel. It was terrified. She was braced for his anger, her eyes squeezed shut, her whole body rigid, as if waiting for a blow. But beneath the terror, there was something else, a desperate, pleading earnestness. She believed what she was saying. The rage didn't vanish. It just froze. It was replaced by a disorienting, nauseating confusion. His mind, his whole being, was a war zone. 5 years of granite-solid certainty fighting against a single, impossible whisper. "What did you just say?" he asked, and the voice that came out was not his own. It was a strangled, broken thing. Her eyes fluttered open. Tears were tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "He's alive," she repeated, her voice cracking. "I know him. I was with him." "No," Preacher breathed, shaking his head, a denial that was more for himself than for her. "No, my son is dead. I buried him." The words felt like ash in his mouth. "They lied," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "They lied to you. The place? They lie about everyone." "What place? Who lied?" His mind was spinning. This was insane. A hallucination brought on by grief and cold. A fever dream on a lonely street corner. The girl seemed to understand that words were not enough. Her small, trembling hand dove into the pocket of her tattered jacket. She fumbled for a moment, and then her hand emerged, clenched in a fist. She held it out to him, opening her fingers slowly, as if revealing a captured butterfly. Resting in her dirty palm was a small wooden bird. Its wings were half spread. It was carved from pine. Preacher's breath hitched in his throat. The world tilted on its axis. He knew that bird. He knew every notch, every smooth curve, every imperfect line of its form. He had carved it himself, sitting on the porch one long summer afternoon, with a small 7-year-old Caleb sitting beside him, watching with wide, adoring eyes. He had made it for him. It was Caleb's favorite treasure. He kept it in a little box beside his bed. The box had been empty after the accident. They'd assumed it was lost in the crash, just another piece of wreckage. But it wasn't. It was here, in the palm of this strange, terrified little girl. He reached out, his huge, scarred hand trembling, and gently plucked the bird from her palm. The wood was smooth, warm from her body. It felt like a live thing. It felt like a key that had just been jammed into a lock he thought had been welded shut 5 years ago. The ice in his soul didn't just crack, it vaporized. In its place, something new and terrifying bloomed, a fragile, agonizingly painful flower of hope. It hurt. Oh God, it hurt more than the grief ever had. The possibility, the sheer blinding chance that it could be true. It was a pain so sharp it brought him to his knees. He was still crouched, but now he was truly kneeling on the filthy pavement, oblivious to the grime and the cold. He looked from the bird in his hand to the girl's face. The confusion was gone. The rage was gone. All that was left was a raw, terrifying focus. He saw the truth in her eyes, as clear and undeniable as the wooden bird in his hand. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was low, steady, and imbued with a power that made the air vibrate. "Tell me everything." He didn't wait for her answer on the cold street. With a gentleness that defied his size, he shrugged off his heavy leather vest. The air hit his back, but he didn't feel it. He wrapped the vest around her small, shivering frame. It was like a 10 on her, the heavy leather swallowing her whole, the reaper on the back standing guard. Then he scooped her up into his arms. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks and courage. She let out a small, startled gasp but didn't fight him. She buried her face in the collar of his shirt, clinging to him as if he were the last solid thing on earth. He turned and strode toward the clubhouse door, the wooden bird clutched in his fist like a holy relic. When he kicked the door open, the wall of noise inside, the music, the laughter, the shouting, hit him, and then died instantly. Every man in the room froze. The blues guitarist's fingers halted mid-strum. A man about to throw a dart held his pose. Conversations died in mid-sentence. In the space of a heartbeat, the room went from a cacophony to a cathedral. 100 pairs of eyes locked onto him. They saw their president, their rock, standing in the doorway with his vest missing. They saw the raw, world-altering emotion on his face, an expression none of them had seen before. And they saw the tiny, shivering bundle he held in his arms. "Road dog," Preacher's voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. "Get her some hot chocolate and something to eat. Now." A hulking man with a beard like a crow's nest and arms like tree trunks nodded once, no questions asked, and moved toward the bar with surprising speed. Preacher carried Lily through the silent crowd of giants who parted before him like the Red Sea. He took her to his private table in the back, a heavy oak monstrosity covered in maps and club business. He sat down in his massive chair and placed her gently on the bench opposite him. She looked around the room at the sea of hard faces staring at her and shrank into the leather vest. These men were living nightmares, figures from a story meant to scare children straight. But the man in front of her, the one who held a piece of her past and his future in his hand, was her only anchor. Road Dog returned, setting a steaming mug of hot chocolate and a plate piled high with a grilled cheese sandwich in front of her. The smell of melted butter and warm bread filled the air, and Lily's stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She looked at Preacher, a silent question in her eyes. "It's for you," he said softly. "Eat." She picked up the sandwich with trembling fingers and took a bite, then another. She ate like a starving wolf, not even seeming to chew, her eyes never leaving his face. Preacher placed the wooden bird on the table between them. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the wood, his gaze intense. "What's your name, kid?" "Lily," she mumbled around a mouthful of sandwich. "Lily," he repeated, the name feeling sacred. "Now, you tell me about my son." And so she did. The entire clubhouse, 100 hardened men who feared nothing, stood in absolute, reverent silence, listening to the whispered story of a 10-year-old girl. She told them about Blackwood Manor, a place that called itself a long-term pediatric care facility, a place hidden away in the deep woods, miles from any town. She told them how she'd ended up there after a fire, her parents gone, a social worker with cold eyes signing papers that made her disappear. She told them about the other kids, the ones whose rich families wanted them hidden away, the ones like her who had no one, their existence erased by bureaucratic cruelty, and she told them about Caleb. "He came about a year after me," she whispered, her eyes distant. "They said he'd been in a bad accident. He couldn't remember anything, not his name, not his home, not you." She looked at Preacher. "They called him Daniel. They give everyone new names." Preacher's jaw was a knot of stone. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. "He was quiet," Lily continued, her voice gaining confidence as the memories flowed. "He was scared, but he was kind. He used to draw. All the time. He drew pictures of a big man on a motorcycle. He didn't know why. He said it was from a dream." A choked sound escaped from somewhere in the room. One of the bikers, a man named Wrench with a skull tattoo on his shaved head, had tears streaming down his face. No one looked at him. They were all locked on Lily. And the bird? Preacher's voice was tight. Where did you get the bird? It was his, Lily said. He kept it hidden. It was the only thing he had from before. He said it felt like home. He didn't know what home was, but he said the bird knew. One day the orderlies found it. They were going to throw it in the furnace. I stole it back for him. She looked down at her hands. He gave it to me before I ran away. I'd been planning it for months. He made me promise. He said, if you get out, find my dad, the man from the dream. Show him the bird. He'll know. He said to tell you he never forgot how to be brave. Silence. A profound, heavy, and dangerous silence filled the room. It was the silence of 100 hearts breaking and 100 fuses being lit at the same exact moment. The air grew thick, charged with a collective, righteous fury that was terrifying in its stillness. Preacher stared at the small wooden bird on the table. His son was alive. His son was a prisoner. His son had sent a 10-year-old girl through hell to find him. His son remembered him. He closed his eyes for a single, long moment. The hollow ocean of grief inside him was gone, replaced by a tsunami of pure, focused rage. It wasn't the hot, blind rage from the street. This was cold. This was methodical. This was the rage of a father whose cub had been stolen. It was the most dangerous force on the planet. He opened his eyes. He looked at Lily, who had finished her sandwich and was sipping the hot chocolate, watching him with an old knowing gaze. In her, he saw a courage that shamed armies. This small, broken child had done what he, with all his power and all his men, had failed to do. She had kept hope alive. He reached across the table and gently rested his hand on her head. Her hair was matted and thin, but his touch was a benediction. You did good, Lily, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. You did so good. You rest now. You're safe. I promise you. You are safe. Then he stood up. He was no longer a grieving father. He was the president of the Reapers of Redemption. He was a king in his own court, and his kingdom was about to go to war. He turned to face his men. Their faces were a reflection of his own, grim, set, ready. There was no need for a rousing speech. There was no need for persuasion. They were a single body with a single mind and a single, burning purpose. Sarge, Preacher barked, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Sarge was his road captain, a wiry older man with a face like a roadmap of hard living and the sharpest tactical mind in the club. Prez, Sarge answered, stepping forward. Full muster, Preacher commanded. Every chapter, every member who can ride. I want them here. Yesterday. Sarge didn't blink. He just nodded, pulled out his phone, and walked toward the back office. He had a cascade of calls to make, a signal to send out across 3 states. Preacher's eyes swept the room. Patch, he called out. Patch was their club medic, a former Army corpsman who had seen things that would make a horror novelist blanch. Get your gear. We're bringing a boy home. He might be hurt. On it, Patch said, already moving. Ghost. This was directed at a younger, leaner biker who was rarely seen without a laptop or a tablet. He was their tech wizard, a hacker who had once been on the FBI's most wanted list before the club gave him a new kind of family. I need everything you can find on a facility called Blackwood Manor, and a social worker who likes to make inconvenient children disappear. Lily, he turned to her, do you remember a name? Lily thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. The papers. I saw them on his desk once. The man who took me, his name was Thompson. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, Ghost repeated, a predatory grin spreading across his face. I'll find him. Then Preacher's gaze fell on a man in the corner, older than most, wearing a clean, pressed version of their vest. He wasn't a brawler, he was a thinker. They called him Counsel. He was a disbarred lawyer who had lost his license for going too far in defending an innocent man. His knowledge of the law's loopholes was encyclopedic. Counsel, Preacher said, I want to know every legal angle, every way they can hide, every piece of paper we need to burn them to the ground, and find me the name of the paramedic in the hospital that pronounced my son dead 5 years ago. Counsel nodded grimly. Consider it done, Prez. The clubhouse, once a stagnant den of grief and routine, was now a humming hive of activity, a machine of righteous vengeance clicking into gear. Men were checking their bikes, cleaning their gear, their movements economical and filled with grim purpose. Preacher walked back to the table where Lily sat, watching the controlled chaos with wide eyes. He knelt down in front of her again. "There's one more thing I need you to tell me, Lily," he said softly. "The man who brought you to that place, the one who took Caleb there, do you remember his name?" Lily's face darkened. "I don't know his name, but I remember his face and his van. It had a snake on the side, a green snake eating its own tail." Preacher's blood ran cold. He knew that logo, Amalgamated Medical Transport, a private ambulance company known for cutting corners. And he knew a man who worked for them, a man who had offered his condolences at the funeral, his face a mask of professional sympathy. A man named Greer. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Outside, a low rumble began. It started as a distant vibration, a tremor you felt in your teeth. Then it grew and grew. It became a rolling thunder that shook the windows in their frames, a sound that vibrated up from the soles of your feet and into your soul. It was the sound of the reapers answering the call. A river of single headlights appeared down the street, stretching back as far as the eye could see. One by one, then 10 by 10, then 50 by 50, motorcycles poured into the industrial park, their engines a deafening, unified chorus of raw power. They came from all directions, a tidal wave of chrome and steel and black leather. Men who had been sleeping, working, eating, living their lives, had dropped everything at their president's command and ridden through the night. They filled the street, the parking lot, every available inch of pavement, their engines idling in a symphony of controlled aggression. There were over 200 of them, a legion, an army bound by loyalty, not law. Preacher stood up and walked to the doorway, Lily's small hand now tucked safely in his. He stood there, looking out at the sea of his brothers, their faces illuminated by the glow of their headlamps, all waiting for his word. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about Lily. This was about every child that corrupt, greedy system had swallowed. This was about a promise. "Greer," he said, his voice a low growl that carried over the rumble of the engines. "First, we visit a man named Greer." The systematic takedown began not with a bang, but with a whisper of tires on suburban asphalt. Greer's house was a modest, beige box on a street of identical beige boxes, manicured lawn, cheerful welcome mat, a basketball hoop over the garage. It was a monument to manufactured normalcy, a facade built to hide the rot within. Preacher didn't lead the full 200 bikes to the man's doorstep. That wasn't the plan. The plan was surgical. The main force remained back at the industrial park, a coiled snake ready to strike, while a smaller contingent, 10 of the club's most imposing figures, rode with Preacher. They parked their bikes down the street, the engines cutting off one by one, plunging the quiet cul-de-sac into an unnerving silence. They walked toward the house, their boots making no sound on the manicured grass. They didn't surround the house like a SWAT team. They simply arranged themselves. 2 by the garage, 2 by the back fence. The rest fanned out across the lawn, standing like statues in the moonlight, their arms crossed over their chests. They were a silent, living wall of judgment. Preacher walked alone to the front door. He didn't pound on it. He didn't kick it in. He pressed the doorbell. The cheerful electronic chime that echoed from inside was a grotesque absurdity in the tense night air. Lights flicked on inside. A moment later, the door opened a crack, held by a security chain. Martin Greer peered out, his face puffy with sleep, his eyes squinting. He was a man dissolving into middle age, soft and unremarkable. "Yes? What is it?" "It's the middle of the—" His voice trailed off as his eyes adjusted and focused on Preacher's face. Recognition dawned, followed swiftly by a wave of confusion, and then a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. He remembered Preacher from the hospital, from the funeral, a grieving father. "Calloway," Greer stammered. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" Preacher said nothing. He simply raised his hand and opened it. In the center of his palm, illuminated by the porch light, sat the small wooden bird. The effect on Greer was instantaneous and total. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. His jaw went slack. His eyes, wide with horror, darted from the bird to Preacher's face, then to the silent figures standing like Gothic gargoyles on his perfect lawn. He understood immediately. The past had come calling. I don't know what that is, he whispered, his voice thin and reedy. A pathetic lie. Don't you? Preacher's voice was unnervingly calm, a low baritone that held no heat, only the absolute cold of certainty. I think you do, Martin. I think you remember a little boy in the back of your ambulance. A boy who was alive. A boy you signed a paper for. A boy you sold. Greer started to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. He tried to slam the door, but Preacher's hand shot out, not grabbing the door, but simply placing his palm flat against it. The wood shuddered but didn't move, held fast by an immovable object. Let's talk, Martin, Preacher said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a thread of steel. You can talk to me, or you can talk to them. He nodded his head toward the silent audience on the lawn. Your choice. The security chain rattled as Greer fumbled with it, his hands slick with sweat. He opened the door. He knew he had no other option. He backed away into his foyer, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Preacher stepped inside, followed by Sarge and Counsel. The other bikers remained outside, a silent, menacing perimeter. Preacher closed the door behind him, and the sound of the latch clicking shut was like a coffin closing. My wife! My kids! Greer stammered, gesturing upstairs. They can sleep, Preacher said. This is about your sins, Martin, not theirs. They stood in the living room, a shrine to suburban aspiration. Family photos on the mantelpiece, plush beige carpets, a large flat-screen television. Greer sank into an overstuffed armchair, his body seeming to collapse in on itself. Counsel pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the coffee table. He didn't say a word. He just pressed record. The small red light was like a drop of blood in the dimly lit room. 5 years, Preacher began, his voice a low, conversational rumble that was more terrifying than any shout. For 5 years I have visited my son's grave every Sunday. For 5 years I thought he was gone. But he wasn't, was he, Martin? Greer shook his head, tears of self-pity and fear streaming down his face. I didn't have a choice, he whimpered. You don't understand. Thompson, he had things on me. Financial trouble, a gambling debt. He owns people. He didn't own you, Preacher corrected him, his voice dropping even lower. He rented your soul, and you gave him a discount. How much, Martin? How much is a boy's life worth? 50,000, Greer choked out, the number hanging in the air like a foul odor. He said the boy had amnesia from the head trauma. No one would know. He said it was a mercy, a clean slate. He had a buyer, a family who wanted a son and couldn't have one. It was a lie, of course. Thompson didn't find homes for children. He filled cages for profit. But it was the lie Greer had told himself for 5 years so he could sleep at night. You left a father to grieve an empty grave for $50,000, Preacher stated, the fact laid bare in all its ugliness. You watched me at the funeral. You shook my hand. Greer broke. A loud, wretched sob escaped him. He curled into a ball in the chair, his face in his hands. I'm sorry, he wailed. I'm so sorry. Preacher felt a flicker of disgust, but no pity. Sorry doesn't bring him home, he said, his voice like ice. Information does. I want everything. The location of Blackwood Manor, the security protocols, Thompson's schedule, every name of every person involved. You will write it all down. You will tell it all to this recorder. And then Counsel will make a phone call to some old friends of his in the state police. They will be very interested in your confession. Greer looked up, a sliver of hope in his terrified eyes. You're turning me over to the police? We are not vigilantes, Martin, Preacher said, a hint of contempt in his tone. We are not you. We don't hide our business in the dark. We are here to bring a boy home. Justice is a separate transaction, and you will pay for it, in a court of law. Believe me, a federal prison will feel like a vacation compared to what my brothers outside would offer you. For the next hour, Greer sang like a canary. He spilled every sordid detail, every name, every password, every dirty secret he had on Thompson and his operation. Counsel took meticulous notes while the recorder captured every word. When it was done, Greer was a hollowed-out shell of a man, the facade of his life stripped away to reveal the coward underneath. Counsel made the call. An anonymous tip detailing a confession related to a child trafficking ring, with evidence to be found at this address. The police would be there within 20 minutes. Preacher, Sarge, and Counsel walked out of the house, leaving Greer sobbing in his armchair, waiting for the blue and red lights that would signal the end of his life as he knew it. The bikers on the lawn fell into step behind them, their mission accomplished. As they walked back to their bikes, Sarge glanced at Preacher. That was restrained, Prez. Preacher looked back at the beige house, a symbol of a quiet, insidious evil. He's a worm, not a wolf, he said, his voice flat. You don't honor a wolf's kill by giving it to a worm. His hell is just beginning. Ours is about to end. He swung his leg over his bike, the leather creaking. He looked at the men around him, their faces grim and determined in the moonlight. Now, he said, his voice a low growl that was answered by the simultaneous roar of 10 engines firing to life. We go to the manor. Blackwood Manor was less a house and more a scar on the landscape. It was nestled deep in 100 acres of dense private forest, accessible only by a single winding dirt road. The main building was a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of dark stone and pointed roofs, surrounded by a 10-foot iron fence topped with cruel-looking spikes. It looked like a place where nightmares were born. Ghost, their tech wizard, had confirmed it was a digital fortress as well. Jamming signals, encrypted surveillance, a private security force. But a fortress is only as strong as its supply lines. The full force of the Reapers of Redemption did not announce their arrival. They seeped into the surrounding woods like a black tide. Their engines cut a mile out. They moved with a discipline that would have impressed a special forces unit, surrounding the entire 100-acre perimeter. There was no escape. Ghost, working from a van parked on the main road, did his work. The security cameras flickered and died. The internet connection went down. The phone lines, both landline and cellular, went silent. Blackwood Manor was now an island, cut off from the entire world. Only then, when the fortress was blind, deaf, and dumb, did Preacher make his move. He didn't lead a charge. He led a procession. The main column of over 100 bikes fired up their engines in unison. The sound was apocalyptic. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical force, a shock wave of sound that rolled through the forest, shaking the trees, sending birds scattering into the night sky. It was the sound of judgment arriving. They rolled slowly, deliberately, up the long dirt road, their headlights cutting through the darkness like 100 piercing eyes. They stopped at the main gate. It was thick, wrought iron, electronically controlled. It didn't matter. Two of the largest bikers, men known only as Crusher and Tiny, dismounted. They attached heavy chains and hooks to the gate, linked to their bikes. With a nod from Sarge, they hit the throttles. The engines screamed, tires dug into the dirt, and with a tortured shriek of protesting metal, the gate was torn from its concrete moorings as if it were made of cardboard. The column rolled through the gap and onto the circular driveway in front of the manor. They didn't dismount. They simply formed a perfect, menacing semicircle facing the front door, their engines idling, a low, threatening growl that was the only sound in the night. A sea of leather and chrome and grim, patient faces. The front door of the manor burst open, and a man strode out, flanked by 4 men in cheap security uniforms who looked profoundly unnerved. The man in the center was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. This was Mr. Thompson. He radiated an aura of arrogant, untouchable wealth. He stopped on the top step, looking down at the army of bikers with an expression of pure, condescending disdain. I don't know who you people think you are, he began, his voice smooth and cultured. But you have made a grave mistake. This is private property. I have already alerted the authorities to your trespassing. I suggest you leave now, before... Before what, Thompson? Preacher's voice cut through his monologue. He cut his engine, and the sudden pocket of silence made his words land with even more weight. One by one, Every other biker followed his lead, until the only sound was the chirping of crickets and the heavy breathing of the security guards. Preacher swung off his bike. He was joined by Patch, the medic, and Counsel, the lawyer. Lily had been left back at the clubhouse, safe with the women and prospects of the club, but she was present in every move Preacher made. He walked slowly toward the steps, stopping at the bottom. He looked up at Thompson, a mountain of leather and denim, staring up at a fragile tower of arrogance. "The police aren't coming for us," Preacher said, his voice calm and even. "They're coming for you. A man named Martin Greer is singing them a very interesting song right now. It's about you. It's about this place. It's about all the children you've buried alive in here." Thompson's mask of arrogant composure cracked. Just a little, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He quickly regained his composure, a sneer twisting his lips. "You're bluffing," he scoffed. "A pathetic attempt at intimidation by a gang of thugs." "Are we?" Preacher asked, a rhetorical question that hung in the air. He took another step up. "I'm not here for your other crimes, Thompson. The state can have you for those. I'm here for one reason. I'm here for my son." Thompson actually laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Your son? I have no idea what you're talking about." "Caleb Calloway," Preacher said, the name a physical blow. "You call him Daniel. He was brought here 5 years ago by your rat, Greer. He's in here, and I am walking out of here with him." The last vestiges of Thompson's composure evaporated. His face went pale. He knew the game was up, but his arrogance was a terminal disease. "And what if I say no?" he hissed. "What will you do? Will your band of animals storm my home? Assault my staff? The law will be on my side." Preacher looked at Thompson. Then he looked at the 4 nervous security guards. Then he looked back at the silent, waiting army of over 200 men behind him. He didn't need to say a word. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the Reapers was a promise of what could happen. Not a promise of chaos, but of a methodical, unstoppable force. "Let me explain something to you," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing Thompson to lean in to hear him. "You see them?" He gestured back at his club. "They are my family, and they know that in this house, you have stolen a piece of my heart. I have told them to wait. I have told them to be patient. But my son is in there, and my patience is running out." He took another step, now on the same level as Thompson. He was a foot taller and twice as wide. Thompson had to crane his neck to look up at him. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "You have 2 choices," Preacher continued, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "You can step aside, and my medic and I will go inside and retrieve my son. No one else gets hurt. Your staff can walk out of here and disappear into the night. We won't stop them. Or you can say no, and I will give a signal, and 200 men who love me will tear this place apart stone by stone until they find my boy. They won't be angry. They'll be efficient, and I will not be responsible for what they find or what they do. The choice is yours, but you will make it in the next 10 seconds." The security guards looked at each other. They looked at the silent sea of bikers. They were paid by the hour, not enough to die for a man like Thompson. One of them slowly unbuckled his belt and let his sidearm clatter to the ground. Then the second, the third, the fourth. They backed away, their hands in the air. Thompson was alone. His face was a mask of pure, impotent fury. He had built an empire on fear and intimidation, and now he was being dismantled by a force he could not comprehend. He was a predator who had just met a dragon. "You will regret this," he spat, his voice trembling. "I already regret the last 5 years," Preacher said, his voice devoid of emotion. He brushed past Thompson as if he were a piece of furniture and walked into the house. Patch and Counsel followed him, leaving Thompson standing on the steps, a king dethroned in his own courtyard, surrounded by the silent, judging eyes of the Reapers of Redemption. The inside of Blackwood Manor was as cold and sterile as its owner's heart. Long, white hallways smelling of antiseptic stretched out under harsh fluorescent lights. There were no pictures on the walls, no splashes of color, nothing to suggest that children lived here. It was a hospital, a prison, a memory-wiping machine. Staff members, nurses in starched uniforms, orderlies with dead eyes. flattened themselves against the walls as Preacher and his men strode past. They offered no resistance. They had heard the engines. They had seen the army outside. Their loyalty to Thompson was a currency that had just been devalued to zero. "Second floor," Counsel said, reading from the notes he'd taken during Greer's confession. "North wing, room 213. They took the stairs two at a time, their boots echoing in the unnatural silence. The north wing was even more desolate. The doors were heavy, solid wood, with small barred windows. They stopped outside room 213. Preacher's heart was a trip hammer against his ribs. He was terrified. What would he find? Would his son even know him? 5 years, an eternity in the life of a child. What had this place done to him? He put his hand on the doorknob. It was locked. He didn't need a key. He took a step back and drove his boot into the wood just beside the handle. The door frame splintered, and the door swung inward with a groan. The room was small, sparse. A bed, a small desk, a single chair. The window was barred. And sitting on the edge of the bed, looking up with wide, startled eyes, was a boy. He was thin, painfully so. His hair, once a bright, sunny blonde, was now a duller shade, cropped short. His face was pale, his cheekbones too prominent. But his eyes, Preacher would know those eyes anywhere. They were his mother's eyes. They were the same eyes that had looked up at him with pure adoration for 7 wonderful years. It was Caleb. He was older. He was haunted. But he was alive. Preacher's breath caught in his throat. Words failed him. He could only stand there, a giant frozen in the doorway, drinking in the impossible sight of his son. Caleb stared back, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. He saw a huge, intimidating man in a leather cut, his face a road map of hard lines and deep emotion. A stranger. "It's okay, son," Patch said softly, stepping forward slowly, his hands up and open. "We're not here to hurt you. We're friends." Caleb flinched back on the bed, his eyes darting between the men. Preacher finally found his legs. He took a slow step into the room, then another. He knelt down just as he had with Lily, bringing himself lower, making himself less of a threat. "Caleb," he said, and his own name for his son sounded foreign on his tongue after 5 years of silence. The boy shook his head. "My name is Daniel," he said, his voice quiet, hesitant. The words were a dagger in Preacher's heart. They had taken his name. They had tried to erase him. "No," Preacher said, his voice thick, raw. "Your name is Caleb, Caleb Michael Calloway, and I am your father." Caleb just stared, his brow furrowed. There was no flash of recognition, only a deep, painful confusion. He looked at Preacher's face, searching for something that wasn't there, a memory that had been stolen from him. My father is dead," Caleb whispered. "They told me, in the accident." Preacher felt his heart break all over again. "They lied," he said, his voice cracking. "They lied about everything." He couldn't find the words to bridge the 5-year canyon between them. How do you prove you are a father to a son who doesn't remember you? He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling, and pulled out the small wooden bird. He held it out on his open palm. "Lily sent me," he said softly. "She told me you were here. She gave me this. She said you'd know it." Caleb's eyes fixed on the bird. The confusion on his face slowly began to recede, replaced by a dawning flicker of something else. He reached out a hesitant, trembling hand and touched the smooth wood. His fingers traced the shape of the wings, the curve of the head. A memory, deep and buried, struggled toward the surface. A flash of sunlight on a porch, the smell of sawdust, a big warm hand guiding his own. A deep, laughing voice, a single word escaped his lips. A whisper. "Dad?" And the dam broke. For Preacher, the world dissolved into a blur of tears. He surged forward, closing the distance between them, and wrapped his arms around his son. He pulled the boy's thin frame against his massive chest, holding him tight, as if he could physically fuse him to his body, to never let him go again. He buried his face in Caleb's hair, and a sound escaped him. A raw, guttural sob of 5 years of pain and loss and rage. And now, a joy so profound it was indistinguishable from agony. Caleb was stiff in his arms for a moment, a stranger's embrace. But then, as his father's tears wet his hair, as the familiar, forgotten scent of leather and motor oil, and something that was just Dad filled his senses, something inside him clicked into place. The embrace didn't feel strange. It felt like coming home. He wrapped his thin arms around his father's thick neck and held on, the first tears he had shed in years streaming down his face. "I knew it," Caleb sobbed into his father's shoulder. "The drawings. The man on the motorcycle. It was you. I didn't forget you. I didn't." "I know, son," Preacher choked out, his voice a wreck. "I know. I'm here now. I'm never leaving you again. I promise." Patch and Counsel stood in the doorway, their own eyes wet, silent witnesses to a miracle. Outside, the first wail of distant sirens began to cut through the night. The authorities were coming. The world was about to find out about Blackwood Manor. Patch stepped forward and gently put a hand on Preacher's shoulder. "Prez," he said softly, "we need to go. Let's get him home." Preacher nodded, not letting go of his son. He finally pulled back, his hands on Caleb's shoulders, his eyes scanning his boy's face, memorizing every new line, every old feature. He was real. He was here. He gently removed his leather cut, the one with the Reaper on the back, and wrapped it around Caleb's shoulders. It was a mantle, a shield, a declaration. He scooped his son up into his arms, and Caleb, for the first time in 5 years, felt completely and utterly safe. As they walked out of the room, Caleb looked over his father's shoulder at the sea of bikers waiting in the driveway. The sight was no longer terrifying. It was awe-inspiring. He saw the hard faces, the tattoos, the leather. But now he saw something else. He saw loyalty. He saw family. "Why?" Caleb asked, his voice a small whisper against his father's chest. "Why are they all here?" Preacher stopped at the top of the steps, looking out at his men. They watched him, their expressions a mixture of relief, pride, and fierce devotion. Thompson was gone, already in the back of a state police car. Other officers were beginning to swarm the building, their faces grim as they started to comprehend the scope of what had happened here. Preacher looked down at his son. "They're here because of a little girl named Lily," he said, his voice clear and strong, for all to hear. "A girl with more courage than any army. She made a promise to you, and she kept it. She came to us. She reminded us what our name means. Redemption." He looked back at his club. "And they are here because we are Reapers, and we never, ever leave family behind. You were lost, son, but you were never, ever forgotten." He carried his boy down the steps, through the parting sea of his brothers, and placed him gently on the seat of his motorcycle, right in front of him. He wrapped his arms around him, one hand on the handlebars, the other holding Caleb securely against his chest. With a single deafening roar, 200 engines came to life. It wasn't a sound of aggression anymore. It was a chorus of triumph, a hymn of reunion. And as the long, magnificent column of steel and thunder rolled away from the darkness of Blackwood Manor and into the promise of the dawn, a father held his son, and a boy who had been a ghost was finally, truly coming home. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet healing and loud justice. The story of Blackwood Manor exploded into the news, a horrifying saga of greed and corruption. Thompson's empire crumbled, and dozens of families, some of whom had grieved for years, were given the miraculous, earth-shattering news that their lost children were alive. But for the Reapers of Redemption, the world outside their clubhouse walls was just noise. Their world had recentered around two people, a boy relearning his own past, and a girl who had given him back his future. Caleb was quiet, reserved, a ship that had been long at sea in a terrible storm, now finding its moorings in a safe harbor. His memory returned in flashes and fragments. The taste of a certain brand of cereal, the feel of a particular blanket, the sound of his father's low laughter. Each recovered memory was a small victory, a stone relayed in the foundation of his identity. He spent hours in the clubhouse garage, watching the men work on their bikes, the smell of grease and gasoline, a powerful, comforting balm to his fractured mind. Lily, however, blossomed. Given a clean room, new clothes, and an endless supply of hot meals, the fear and desperation began to peel away from her like old, dried paint. Color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes, once old and weary, began to sparkle with the mischief and curiosity of a normal 10-year-old. The bikers, these huge, gruff, intimidating men, were utterly bewitched by her. They treated her like a princess. Road Dogg, the hulking giant who had first fed her, discovered she liked to draw and presented her with a professional art set that must have cost him a week's pay. Ghost the hacker set her up with a brand new tablet and taught her how to code simple games. Wrench, the man who had cried listening to her story, spent hours patiently teaching her how to play the guitar, his calloused fingers guiding her small ones on the frets. She had no family to return to. The fire that had taken her parents was real. She was an orphan, a ward of a state that had already failed her spectacularly. But she wasn't homeless. Not anymore. One evening, a few weeks after the rescue, Preacher called a formal club meeting. Church, as they called it. The clubhouse was packed. Caleb sat beside his father, a quiet presence. Lily sat on the other side, sketching in her new notepad. Preacher stood at the head of the heavy oak table. "We have a situation," he said, his voice resonating with its usual authority. "The state wants to place Lily in a foster home." A low growl rumbled through the room. The idea was unthinkable. "She doesn't belong to the state," Sarge said, his voice flat. "She belongs with us." A chorus of deep, affirmative grunts and hell yeahs echoed him. "I agree," Preacher said, "but the law has its rules." He looked at Counsel. Counsel stood up. "The rules can be bent," he said with a slight smile. "I filed a motion. Given the state's gross negligence in her case, and given our role in exposing that negligence, a judge I happen to know is very sympathetic to our position. I've petitioned for a private guardianship." "A guardian has to be a single, stable individual," Preacher continued, his eyes scanning the room. "Someone who can provide a home, a future." He let the words hang in the air. Then his gaze settled on Lily. He knelt down in front of her, the now familiar gesture of a giant humbling himself. "Lily," he said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "This is your home now if you want it. These men, they are your family, your uncles, your protectors. And I would be honored if you would let me be your legal guardian. If you would let me and Caleb be your family." Lily looked up from her sketchbook. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. She looked at Preacher's earnest, hopeful face. She looked at Caleb, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. She looked around the room at the 200 hardened faces watching her, their expressions full of a fierce, protective love. She didn't have to say a word. She just launched herself from her seat and threw her arms around Preacher's neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with happy sobs. The room erupted. Cheers and applause shook the rafters. The Reapers of Redemption had a new daughter. Later that night, they held a celebration. A massive barbecue in the clubhouse yard. Music played. Laughter flowed freely. Preacher stood by the fire, watching his two children. Caleb was animatedly talking to Wrench about engine schematics, a genuine smile on his face. Lily was sitting on Road Dogg's shoulders, directing the placement of hot dogs on the grill like a tiny general. His heart, which had been a hollow cavern for 5 long years, was full. It was overflowing. Counsel came and stood beside him, handing him a cold beer. "She's a good kid," Counsel said, nodding toward Lily. "She's a hero," Preacher corrected him. "She saved us all." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their chaotic, beautiful family. "You know," Counsel said thoughtfully, "we should give her a patch, something to make it official." Preacher smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "I've already got something in the works." A week later, at the next Sunday meeting, Preacher presented Lily with a small, custom-made leather vest, a perfect miniature of his own. On the back, where the snarling Reaper skull would normally be, was a beautifully embroidered patch. It was a small wooden bird, its wings half spread, as if caught between perching and taking flight. Beneath it, in simple, elegant script, were 2 words, "Little Bird." Lily traced the stitching with her finger, her eyes wide with wonder. It was her name, her story, her place in this family, stitched into leather and loyalty. She put on the vest, a perfect fit, and beamed a smile so bright it outshone every piece of chrome in the room. She was home, clears throat. 1 year later, the sun is warm on the back of Preacher's neck. It's a Sunday afternoon, and the clubhouse yard is filled with the smell of barbecue smoke and the sound of laughter. It's a familiar scene, but everything is different. The world has shifted from grayscale to vibrant color. Caleb, now a lanky teenager, is no longer haunted. He's thriving. His memory is mostly restored, the shadows chased away by the relentless love of his father and his 200 uncles. He's a natural with a wrench, his hands, so much like his father's, sure and steady as he helps Wrench tune an old Harley. He looks up and catches his father's eye, and his grin is pure, unadulterated joy. He is whole again. Lily, our little bird, is perched on a picnic table, her sketchbook open, her brow furrowed in concentration. She's drawing a portrait of Sarge, who is posing with a comical, uncharacteristic gravity. Her vest is worn, the leather softened with a year of adventures. She is no longer a ghost from an alley. She is vibrant, confident, and fiercely loved. She is the heart of the club, a constant reminder of what they fight for. Preacher watches them, a mug of coffee in his hand. He is no longer a ghost either. He is a father. He is a guardian. The hole in his heart has been filled, not just by the return of his son, but by the arrival of his daughter. He is complete. You see, this story isn't really about motorcycles, or tattoos, or the fearsome reputation of a biker club. It's not even about revenge. It's about a promise. A promise made by a lost boy to a brave girl in the darkest of places. A promise that hope can survive, even when it seems all is lost. It's about the truth that heroes don't always wear capes and fly through the sky. Sometimes they wear worn leather and ride on two wheels. Sometimes they are covered in scars and ink, their faces hard from a life the world has judged them for. Sometimes the most fearsome angels are the ones who have been through hell themselves, because they are the only ones who know the way back. Look around your own life. Who are the protectors? Who are the ones who would ride into a storm for you? No questions asked. That is your family. That is your club. It's not about blood. It's about loyalty. It's about showing up. Tell me in the comments, who was your preacher? Who was the person who stood up for you, who saw you when you felt invisible? Where are you watching from? What part of the world holds your family? Because every single one of us has the capacity to be a protector. We all have the choice to be the one who stops, who listens to the whisper, who offers a hand to someone lost in the dark. If you believe in that kind of family, the kind forged in loyalty and fire, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Become a part of this family right here. Stand with us, ride with us, and let's keep telling the stories that matter. The stories that remind us that even in the darkest night, the rumble of hope can be heard just on the horizon.